On November 16, 1957, local hardware store owner Bernice Warden of Plainfield, Wisconsin, went missing only to be found later that evening, hanging by her feet in a barn owned by Ed Gein. Her body had been prepared in the same fashion that one would do with a freshly killed deer. Her head was later found in a bag inside the home on the property. Inside the home, police investigators would also find a trash can made from human parts, chairs that had been reupholstered in human skin, skulls on the bedpost of Gein's room, leggings made from human leg skin, multiple masks made from the faces of different women, a full corset made from a woman's torso, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, a belt made from women's nipples, a lampshade made out of faces, 4 noses, a set of lips on one of the window's drawstrings, among other objects made from human parts. Gein would later say that he was trying to make an entire suit made from women's skins, so that he knew what it would be like to crawl inside of his mother and to be just like her. But I don't need to tell you that, do I? And the reason why I don't is because you already know it, as people have done what they always do, and have spent the last 70 or so years making mass entertainment about the worst things that happened in these people's lives. Now, one thing that is often misaccredited here that we need to get out of the way first is the idea that Psycho was the first major work of art dealing with the American shock and reaction to Gein's crimes, which in truth it really wasn't. And as such, the film adaptation the following year similarly would only be so in a marginal way. You can't talk about Psycho without bringing Gein up. In the consciousness of the public's relationship to media, the two are deeply interconnected, but the similarities were, for the most part, actually accidental. In fact, the majority of Psycho had already been written by the time that it was discovered what Gein had been doing on his mother's farmhouse. Now, there is the funny coincidence that Robert Bloch was living just 35 miles away from Gein at the time. And it is true that Bloch made some edits to the text to incorporate allusions to Gein in the final processes of finishing the novel. But the fact of the matter is that the novel was predominantly the case of Bloch imagining a killer who just so happened to actually kind of exist. Publishing is a long and slow process, generally speaking, especially for someone's debut novel, although it is true that he had been publishing short stories for 20 years, and was far from a rookie. But still, to have Gein's crimes be discovered in November of 1957, and then Psycho be published in April of 1959, is not the most realistic time frame for the book to have actually been based on these events, if you really think about it. Especially when you consider that November of 1957 is when his crimes were discovered, but that his trial was not started until November of 1968, and a lot of things related to his motivations surrounding the death of his mother, and why he did the things that he did, would not have become publicly known until around this time, probably. Bloch himself was even surprised to learn that these aspects of Gein's mother and Norman Bates's mother lined up so well on total accident, saying, "I discovered how closely the imaginary character I'd created resembled the real Ed Gein, both in overt act and apparent motivation." So I say all of this to say that with this information, then many would assume then, knowing this, that 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre would have actually been the first film dealing with Gein in any substantial and direct way. But this is also not the case, as in February of that year we saw the release of Deranged, which in its own way is a much more visceral and direct take on Gein as a figure, and is both worse off as well as deeply interesting because of this. It is, in my eyes, one of the weirdest films to come out of 1970s horror cinema, which was a period known for being pretty weird. So the way that this all came to be is somewhat strange in itself. One of the producers on the film, Tom Carr, who only worked on 3 films in his career including this one, was obsessed with the details of the Gein case and deeply desired to make a horror film about him. His actual job was in the music industry, working as a promoter for acts like Rod Stewart, The Temptations, Three Dog Night, and Led Zeppelin, and he used the money that he made from doing this to put together the film's $200,000 budget. This was also co-produced by Bob Clark, a talented filmmaker with a bizarre career, spanning horror classics such as Black Christmas and Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, to culturally important films of the 1980s, like Porky's and A Christmas Story, as well as some of the worst films ever made, like Super Baby's Baby Geniuses 2, The Karate Dog, and Blonde and Blonder. And I know it sounds like I'm making fun of him, but I'm really not. I love a man who can do it all. This was also directed by friend of Clark, Jeff Gillen, who worked with Clark on a number of occasions, including co-writing his first film with him, the sexploitation picture She-Man: A Story of Fixation. Also, I assume that every person who is watching this video actually knows Gillen, but is just unaware of it, as he would later on play the scary mall Santa in A Christmas Story. The film follows Ezra Cobb, who is essentially Gein in everything but name, which almost lends a surreal aspect to the film because one gets the idea that they did this so that they would not be so beholden to the real facts, but then they painstakingly stick to certain details of Gein's life that get in the way of natural storytelling, which results in a somewhat messy film that never knows what it wants to be. It is one part faithful Gein biopic, and one part crazy original serial killer gore film. And as a result of those two conflicting storytelling ideologies, it leaves us with a project that ultimately feels disjointed. Cobb here, by the way, is played masterfully by Roberts Blossom, who you all would know as the scary yet secretly quite friendly and helpful old man from Home Alone. I love how Blossom seems genuinely insane and unhinged in this. It is really rare for an actor to be able to be doing what he's doing just with his eyes. Like, making a character seem sincerely mentally unwell from artists who are doing fine mentally is a really difficult task. So often it just reads as fake, which is one of just many reasons that I usually don't fuck with films made about serial killers, even fictional ones. Because it is near impossible for someone who is not evil to be able to conjure that evil from within themselves in a way that can be captured on the screen. But everything that he's giving to the camera in this just feels so authentic. Every move that he makes just sings. Genuinely, I mean this when I say that it is one of the best performances in horror film history. Both Harvey Keitel and Christopher Walken auditioned for the part back when production began in 1973, but they were both turned away at the time for being too young. And I'm glad that neither got the role because they would not have brought to the table what Blossom is doing in this. Cobb is horribly reclusive. Despite his obsession with the corpses of women, he reads as being potentially gay, or is so stunted by his relationship with his mother that he is all but sexless. And some may say that this is unintentional, but I would disagree. Late into the film, Cobb attempts to have sex with a woman but is plagued by visions of his mother that prevents him from truly engaging in the act, which, out of frustration, turns his desires from sex into violence. There's a clear connection between those two concepts for Cobb, and the link between them is his relationship with his mother. Later in the film, there's another really strange moment where Cobb is having sex with a woman who is a medium, who has momentarily left her body to channel the spirit of her dead husband, who is informing Cobb that he can no longer sexually satisfy his wife since leaving this earthly plane of existence, and that he needs Cobb to do this in his stead. And everything about this reads as an explicitly gay sex scene to me, as while the act is happening, the spirit of the husband is still within the body of the wife. Just from a pure filmmaking perspective, it is clear that Gillen wasn't experienced behind the camera, but in this inexperience come ideas that I believe normally wouldn't be seen through a more polished perspective. I think this is one of the reasons that I'm so appealed to outsider art, as I believe that sometimes when someone goes through school or training for their craft, it sometimes narrows the scope of their imagination to a degree, at least in how they may approach certain problems that will inevitably appear in the filmmaking process. A major example of this is the fact that we start on this very uncanny shot of this reporter, whose existence is never explained. He is talking directly to us about these crimes, as if they've already happened, but he is able to physically walk through the space and interact with it as well as if he had been transported into the past. And narratively, it works and is engaging, but I don't really think that this is something that most would decide to do, and I respect it for being a bold choice, even if at times it's a little clumsy. And also in this inexperience, I believe, is to an extent where the root of the tone of the piece can be pinpointed, that to me can only be described in one word: perverse. The film is so raunchy in tone that Clark even took his name off the project as the producer, as he didn't fully want to be associated with it. Everything about the film is related to Cobb's relationship to his mother, and as such, that is the only way in which this film can be seen. And it makes sense then that we begin the film with her death, which is an exceptionally upsetting scene that is presented with such a grounded earnestness that you don't really see in a lot of films today. Cobb's mother, laying in bed, realizes that she's about to die, and then says to Cobb, to herself, and to the universe itself, "So it's to be now, is it?" And Cobb, unwilling to accept the reality of the situation, starts maniacally force-feeding her soup even after she starts vomiting blood up into it. It's genuinely repulsive, and as a work of art, it is completely exploitative of the situation that actually happened. But with this scene in particular, there's also something extremely energetic about the piece, something captivating, and in that, I think if we found the reason why we are so appealed to this, we can begin to understand the cultural fascination with serial killers as a concept. Like, later in the film, a cop is smelling his breath to check for alcohol, and it is so foul that it almost knocks the cop over, which to me almost implies that he's been kissing his mother's body while alone in the home, or is engaging with other intimate acts like that. I think the ambiguity of it is what is most upsetting. The best line of dialogue in the film ties into this deep perversion that the project is trying to channel, as later on Cobb is talking with the corpse of his mother and tells her that he's going to go out and kill the medium that we just spoke about a moment ago, and that he desires to bring her body back to the house to join the others that he's collected. And in this moment, he asks his mother's body, "Can you just imagine what it must be like to swim in all that fat?" Another standout scene for me, which is one of the reasons that I desired to make this video, is when Cobb kills one of his victims, a young girl named Mary. And he does so after a horrific dinner scene, where the table is filled with corpses, and human parts can be found nailed to the walls. A scene which to me is so interesting, not only because it is the best moment in the film, but also because it predates one of the most infamous scenes in horror film history, that plays out in almost the exact same way. And what makes this all the more interesting to me is that I can't find any reference to any dinner from hell-like event actually ever happening in Ed Gein's life. And that's why I think this scene is so fascinating, and is why I keep thinking about it and its connection to Texas Chainsaw. Now, there's some interesting ways to look at this, and upon thinking about it from every angle, I would argue that it is ultimately probably just a case of parallel thinking going on here between these two films that share the same subject matter, and that it is likely that no artistic plagiarism happened here. So, Texas Chainsaw was released in October of 1974, and Deranged was released in February of 1974. Texas Chainsaw was filmed in the summer of '73, and Deranged was filmed in February of '73. So, either way that you look at it, Deranged beats Texas Chainsaw to the punch with its dinner scene, and yet, Texas Chainsaw is the film that is remembered for its iconic dinner, and rightfully so. It is a masterclass of a scene, one of the best to ever do it. Part of the reason for this not being widely known absolutely has to do with the fact that after its initial run in theaters in 1974, for unknown reasons, Deranged was considered lost media, until a copy of it was found in Florida in the mid-90s, where it was then released on VHS. And considering the fact that it has always been a difficult film to watch, certainly has not helped its overall legacy. But as I've said in the past, it isn't ever a question of who got there first, but instead, it is a question of who did it in a more iconic way, who got the attention. And in that, it is undeniable that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre does everything that Deranged is doing, just with more flair, style, and even taste, as weird as that may be to say. And Deranged really is a film that is being produced in explicitly and purposefully bad taste. And that is in part what makes it so fun. It revels in shock, whereas Texas Chainsaw, even though it, yes, is bombastic in style, is actually understated in what it actually is showing on the screen. It almost doesn't have a single drop of blood in it, and is all the better for that, as the fear in that film lies in your mind, It is more psychological, where Deranged is often going for the gross out more than anything else. Despite playing with similar subjects and aesthetics, what they're actually doing with the horror itself is drastically different. Texas Chainsaw is almost cosmic in its treatment of the horror, and the horror is more internalized than anything else. It is about sitting with the concept of meat and how thin the line is between us and animals, about consumption, about violence, whereas Deranged is more of an outright gore picture with less intention and meditation to what it is trying to achieve and show us with its imagery. In fact, Deranged had to cut multiple scenes out of the film related to depictions of both necrophilia and cannibalism in order to achieve an R rating. And it's important to note that both of those notably were things that Gein was believed to have never actually ever engaged in. If you enjoy my work and would like to support me on Patreon, you can do so by going to patreon.com/praiseofshadows. There you can get early access to all of my work and input on some of my future projects that I take on, as well as joining in on monthly private streams. You can also find my second channel, IPOS Dark Sides, where I make individual smaller videos focused on single movies. Today I'd personally like to thank Michael, Mika, Monez, MS Book Gal, Mumbly Bob 6, and My Name Isn't Dave. As a side tangent, the next year Werner Herzog and Errol Morris of The Thin Blue Line fame partnered to make a documentary about the Gein case that would never be finished, after making the observation that they felt had gone unnoticed up until that point in time, that all of the confirmed graves that had been disturbed by Gein formed a circle around his mother's grave, and that they believed there may have been a more ritualistic, spiritual aspect to the crimes than had even been speculated on at the time. The pair even wondered about the unlikely possibility that perhaps tunnels were dug by him from those graves to the mother's grave, or that she was perhaps not even in her grave anymore at all. They even started making preliminary plans to have her casket illegally exhumed to check to see if she was still in it, which they never ended up doing, and the project would later be abandoned. But not before doing extensive research and conducting dozens of hours of interviews with locals involved with the case, including several sessions with Gein himself in prison. The details of this episode was made public in the issue of The New Yorker that was published on February 6th of 1989. Morris and Herzog discussed the question that Morris and Dr. Arndt had left unanswered, whether or not Gein had disinterred his mother, and they set a date for a rendezvous in Plainfield in the summer of 1975. The idea was that, with shovels in the moonlight, they would satisfy their curiosity. When Herzog arrived in Plainfield, however, he had been working on a film in Alaska and was now driving toward New York. No familiar face was there to greet him. He made a phone call to California and learned that Morris had had second thoughts. But primarily what I wanted to talk about here today in relation to all of this is two questions. The first, should we be making art for mass audiences based on the lives of people who have participated in the deepest forms of evil? And two, if we do decide to engage with these subjects and produce this art, in what way should we approach them as subjects? The first question, I think, is simple to answer. No, we should not be making films or art about these individuals. It should not be seen as acceptable. The sheer amount of true crime documentaries, podcasts, YouTube channels, fictional films, you name it, is shameful and clearly profiteering off the deaths of innocents and should not be culturally normalized as much as it is. And the fact that it is, I believe, is one stone in the path of a greater cultural problem of irony-poisoned desensitization and dehumanization that has dominated the greater online landscape for the past 2 decades for the most part. These people who did these acts lived in obscurity, and they should die in obscurity. In the entire history of the United States, there have been an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 serial killers, some of which were incredibly more prolific and destructive than the ones that get talked about all the time. Dahmer had 17 victims, Bundy had 20, Ed Gein had 2, the Zodiac had 7, but Amy Archer Gilligan had 50 victims. Do you know her? Jake Bird is suspected of 46 murders. Carol Cole killed 35. Richard Cottingham is suspected of at least 80. Donald Leroy Evans at around 70. The Death Angels are suspected also of around 70. Patrick Kearney estimated at 43. Randy Kraft is believed to have killed at least 60. But do we know any of these people? I didn't before looking deeper into them for this project, and I would say that the average well-adjusted person does not, and there's a reason for that. And I think the difference here is based on the concepts of sensationalism and exploitative art, where the media, both journalistic and entertainment, have turned the ones that are culturally discussed constantly into American gods of sorts. Cultural deities representative of a rot and morbid curiosity at the core of this country, where entertainment and death are far too equated to be one and the same. A country that by far has more people engaging in this vicious behavior that is serial killing than any other country in the world. And there's a reason for that. And I think what I've shown here is argument enough. These people should not be remembered for what they did. They should not be celebrated in their own way with films made about them and their awful deeds. They should be buried in unmarked graves and entirely forgotten. I think it is very interesting that out of the thousands who have engaged in serial killing, only about 15 or so have received this treatment, and the responsibility for that, in my opinion, falls squarely on a small group of opportunistic artists who desire to make easy money exploiting these awful situations. The second is a question ultimately of depiction through abstraction. In Psycho, Deranged, Silence of the Lambs, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we are presented with different culturally significant fictional slices of artistic interpretations of the same man. And this is in direct opposition in a way as to how Ryan Murphy would approach the subject just last month with the show Monster, where it is a more outright biographical depiction of Gein the man as he supposedly actually was. If you can even call it biographical considering the levels of artistic liberty that Murphy tends to take within his projects that involve real-life subjects. That is, also if you can even call it artistic liberty, as I think when it comes to real killers who actually did these things in real life, doing these glorifications of them that helps to enshrine them into these positions of mythological cultural deities is about the least artistic way that one could go about approaching a film or television show that is dealing with them as subjects. Charlie Hunnam's Gein and Gunnar Hansen's Leatherface are approaching the exact same problem. How do we show such horrible things that really happened in a work of art that then tries to extrapolate original narrative meaning for an audience from these events? And I think just outright showing them as they were and saying, look at this crazy shit, this really happened, is both trashy and somewhat unnecessary as well as reductive. I don't necessarily think that documentaries should be made about these subjects either, as I've said my opinions on the true crime industrial complex, and they're very well known, where, monetized misery is king. But I do think that a documentary, when done in earnest, is a lot less harmful depending on the intention of the filmmaker than at least whatever it is that they're doing with this series, which is something that has been covered so extensively we probably shouldn't spend much time on it here. From instances where the relatives of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims were upset about how their family members were portrayed, to Lyle and Eric Menendez saying that they felt as if they were not portrayed accurately, to which Murphy responded by writing off their complaints, saying, "I think it's a lot of faux outrage. I think that this show is the best thing that has happened to the Menendez brothers in 30 years in prison. They've said as much. They've told their lawyers as much. I think it's very difficult to have your lives splashed out all over the world. But I think that the show is doing a really wonderful job of having people talk about their case, talk about their innocence or their guilt, talk about whether they should have another trial, should they be freed. I also think that a great distance of time from the events depicted makes these questions morally easier to answer. For instance, I think a documentary about Gein would be much less harmful than, say, one on Dahmer, simply because one was in the 1950s and one was in the 1990s, and anyone who has significant relationship to the Gein case has probably passed by this point. In that same light, I would also argue that a documentary on, say, Jack the Ripper would be less harmful than one on Gein because, again, we're dealing with a greater distance of time. That doesn't mean that I think doing it would be necessarily good, but certainly less exploitative. Especially if these projects were done with an intent not just to show the barbarism of what happened with a figure like Gein, but instead to additionally demonstrate how that madness reflects a certain aspect of rural Americana. Everyone is a product of the environment that they are created in, and if nothing else, I think when looking at photographs of Ed Gein and the art that was created in the response to his actions, then one could argue that his particular apotheosis is one of being made into a deity representative of a certain shade of America itself. There are, in my eyes, few films that are more about America as a concept than the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I guess ultimately what I'm trying to say here is that despite their failures or successes as works of art, I believe that works like Texas Chainsaw for Gein or Joyce Carol Oates' Zombie for Dahmer are much more artistically interesting ways to examine these subjects as human monsters, whereby abstracting them into characters that did not actually exist, we can maybe explore the humans that inspired them in ways that are not literally true to fact but instead emotionally true, which I think can be more beneficial potentially to the culture. Through a distance of abstraction in fiction, we can build possibly understanding, and maybe also work towards a more ethical and empathetic and less opportunistic media landscape. Because empathy is in a way the great extension of cinema, and characters like Sally Hardesty or Laura Palmer are given much more dignity and compassion than any real-life victim is when they are portrayed on screen. And to me, that is very telling on the gulf of distance between films that are interested in capitalizing on these real-life murderers and serial killers, and films that are instead more interested in exploring the depths and capacity of human evil within man, and how that evil affects everything around it. And it is in this place that Deranged sits strangely in my mind as a film. It is not a film about Ed Gein, it is a film about a character named Ezra Cobb, and yet, he dresses like Gein. He acts like Gein. He has an obsession with his mother like Gein. He kidnaps a woman from a hardware store while buying antifreeze at the end of the film, and then proceeds to hang her upside down in his barn, which mirrors the way that Gein was caught in real life. And even though there is an abstraction into fiction between Gein and Cobb, the distance is not the same as it is with the other artistic interpretations like Bates, Buffalo Bill, or Leatherface. And I believe that is to the film's failing. It is both simultaneously an artistic interpretation of events in real life, and it's also true crime slop. Ideologically, it shares more with Murphy's approach to the subject than it does with Hitchcock, Demme, and Hooper, even down to reveling in the grotesqueness of the case where others would only more allude to the more vulgar aspects of what happened here. Which I know people may disagree with, but I think is genuinely the case. Whereas outside all of the taxidermy stuff, Texas Chainsaw is constantly trying not to push into the realm of being outright trashy with its presentation. And I think one only has to compare the dinner scenes of both films to understand what I mean here. Whereas in Texas Chainsaw, all of the decorations made from human parts have been dried like genuine leather. But in Deranged, they're still gored, less ornately and skillfully done. We're presented with rotting parts instead of genuine artistry, and I mean that both literally and metaphorically. And I think all of this creates a strange legacy for this film as a work that I enjoy despite having to classify it as an outright example of trash cinema. And yet, at the end of the day, there's just something compelling about it. The way that it's filmed, the performances that they were able to capture. There's a real attempt at making a genuine film here that does not match the tone and approach to the subject itself, which is what I find so interesting about it. So, March of 1958, less than half a year after the discovery of what Gein had been doing for most of the past decade, the town of Plainfield had a spiritual end to the saga of pain that they had found themselves in. Harvey Polson, the local man who had been put in charge of handling Gein's affairs, as at the time Gein was deemed to be insane and unfit to stand trial, or even manage his own money or estate, decided to auction off the property that the horrors had taken place in. The auction was set to take place on the 30th, and leeches immediately began to capitalize off the event, Food vendors were planning to attend to sell to the crowd that would gather. Some created memorabilia like postcards to sell to those that traveled to see the house. There were rumors that an unidentified party had gathered enough capital to outbid anyone who appeared, to turn the home into a roadside traveler's murder museum, dedicated to showcasing the crimes of the Plainfield Ghoul. But on March 20th, in the middle of the night before the auction was able to be held, the Gein house was burned to the ground. Frank Warden, the son of Gein's last victim, Bernice Warden, was the first firefighter to respond to the scene. The cause of the fire has still never been determined, and when Gein was told that his home had been burned to the ground before the auction could take place, his response was simply, just as well. The only thing unaffected by the fire was Gein's car, which was sold to a traveling carnival operator named Bunny Gibbons, who made the vehicle a mainstay of his carnival, charging $0.25 per person to come in and see it. That July, he reportedly had over 2,000 paying customers visit Gein's ghoul car. And I think there's something that we can learn about life here. I think that maybe this event is allegorical of perhaps how we should treat these things when they inevitably happen. And that maybe as a culture, we should just burn the fucking things down and not let them get out of control before the Ryan Murphys and the other carnival barkers of the world show up to charge us just to tell us about how grisly and awful all of this really was.
I've seen my ex last night, Mama, at a dance at Miller's store. She was with that Jack White, Mama, I killed them both, and they're buried under Jenkins' sycamore. Well, don't you think I'm psycho, Mama? You can pour me a cup. If you think I'm psycho, Mama, you better let 'em lock me up. Don't hand that dog to me, Mama, I might squeeze him too tight. And I'm as nervous as can be, Mama, so let me tell you about last night. Well, I woke up in Johnny's room, Mama, standing right by his bed, with my hands near his throat, Mama, wishing both of us was dead.